difficulty this week was selecting which direction and what to focus on, because I believe you could get 6 or 7 sermons out of what's going on here. And it kind of opens up like a Hollywood movie, except in our story today, we know it's true and we know that God was involved. And why I think it looks kind of like a Hollywood movie, you've got the hero in the story and the hero is Moses. And we have a hero that is put in a basket through faith and goes down the river Nile to avoid being killed. And Pharaoh's daughter picks the child up, and Moses is basically the adopted son of Pharaoh's daughter. And I can only imagine how nice a life Moses could have lived if he didn't get involved. He's got it all. He may have even been the future king of Egypt. I mean, it would have been between him and Ramses II. So he's got that path he could choose, but at the same time, he goes out to look at the people, the Hebrew people. And he sees an Egyptian beating a Hebrew. And then he makes a decision to get involved. And how does Moses get involved? He killed a man and hit him in the sand. Well, a person who had the opportunity to sit on the sidelines and live the good life just made a choice to get involved. And that seems to be the kind of movies in Hollywood that captivate me, the Liam Neesons of the world, the Bruce Willis. You know, it could have been easy or better or different, but they saw something that troubled them, they got involved, now they're in the middle of it. And that's where our story picks up today. And, you know, we've got a man who's been called by God, and there's a lot of confusing things. And I think what Moses goes through, what the people of Israel go through, is something we can all relate to at some level in our life today. And just as God had promised Jacob and his family things, that promise from God was still there with them. You know, Jacob provided the strength that the Israelites needed in captivity. But when Jacob and all of the people of his generation had passed away, God protected the Israelites through strength of numbers. I can't think of any place in civilization history where a group of people were conquered, put in captivity, and then their numbers flourish and they multiply at such great numbers. Usually it's just the opposite. You know, you see civilizations lost or scattered, but that's not what happens here. And it's a combination of, I don't know if it's the will of the Israelite people that, you know, no matter what we face, we survive, or is it God has always protected his people and that's what he's doing here in Egypt? And, you know, when you look at what does change with Moses in chapter 2, you know, I want to just go back to scripture for a moment in chapter 2. One day when Moses had grown up, he went out to the people and looked on their burdens. He looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and placed him in the sand. And from there, he then hears God reveal himself to him. And as we read in the scripture from chapter 3, who are you, God, is what Moses is asking. And in ancient times, this was probably about 1465 BC, a name was very important in ancient times. It was a summation of who you are. Joseph of Arimathea. Your name, your location, it told a lot about you. So Moses asking who God is pretty substantial. And then God responds, because just as it is a summation of who you are by revealing what your name is, not telling somebody what your name is shows an unwillingness to give oneself completely. So if there is a name that is known, it does imply some power or control within that person. And God said in the scripture, I am who I am. My name is Yahweh. So we've got Moses trying to figure out exactly who God is. We know that God exists through Genesis and through those promises, and now Moses is seeing it before his eyes. And just as God responded when it got bad between Cain and Abel, God responds here in Egypt as well. And that's the whole title and point of the sermon this morning, is God heard, God remembered, God saw, and God knew. And what was it that God heard? God heard the Israelites cry out for help. That's the same thing that happened with Cain and Abel. As the blood was filling the street, there was a cry out to God. And God heard that prayer through the blood. And God heard the cry of the Israelites here. And he remembered the covenant that he had given. He had seen firsthand what was happening in Egypt and to his people. And he knew what they were going through, and he knew how to get them through it. So we've got Cain and Abel, a story of crying out. We've got this story in Exodus of crying out. First sermon that was preached in July was about crying out and God hearing. We heard another crying out in the third sermon. So we've got examples of what happens both personally and biblically when somebody cries out for God's help. And we can see in chapter 2, verse 23, and the people of Israel groaned under their bondage and cried out for help, and their cry under bondage came up to God. God's response, much like Cain and Abel, heard the cry of children in suffering. And the Lord is going to lead them to the land of milk and honey. And he's going to do that through choosing Moses. And, Moses responds initially to God with, who am I that I should go? That was one of the first questions I had. Why should it be me? I can think of better people equipped. I can think of better examples. And just as I was having a conversation with God about what should prevent me from this, just as Moses was doing, God provided a solution for every argument made, both in my life and in Moses' life. And, Moses says he wasn't a great public speaker, so he gets Aaron. Moses says, well, why will Pharaoh listen to me? I'm going to harden his heart. He'll eventually let you go. All these things that worried Moses, God provided answers to. And I think that's where I am in awe of the will of God and the providence of God, because at no point in my life can I make sense of what happened and why it happened until it's over and I look back. Then it makes sense. But we worship a God who can see the now and envision the future and where it could go. And as I mentioned a couple of Sundays ago, I knew God was in this call because some of the things and the blessings that I received, I didn't pray for because I didn't know that was possible. I got something above what I could even comprehend, and that's what's going to happen in this story, and that's what's going to happen through the rest of the Old Testament and confirmed in the New Testament as well. But I can understand the inward reflection of Moses in this time, because he's not going to know 100% that he is called until the end, because there's so much he's got to go through and so much unknown, and you can't tell him everything up front. Can you imagine, approaching Moses, who's already concerned about being the leader, and it's like, well, we're going to send some locusts down here, and then march them right into the water, and I'll divide the sea. The sea is one of the most scary places to be in 1400 BC. We don't understand weather, we don't understand, a lot of things, but, it's going to be okay. And God tells Moses, I'm going to be with you. And, you've got the lead character and our hero in this story, Moses, versus Pharaoh. But just as much in Exodus is the God of Israel, Yahweh, against the gods of Egypt. And what is comforting about what happens in chapters 4 and 5 of Exodus, and our reading today was from the middle of chapter 3. 4 and 5 validates that faith does work. And in chapter 4, we start with Moses getting all the signs. He has that great rod, and then the rod becomes a serpent. And then God tells him to pick it up by the tail, and it becomes a rod again. His encounter with Pharaoh rebuking him, the retaliation of Pharaoh on the Israelites. They had a workload that they must meet every day. And what Pharaoh does to inflict even more suffering on the people is, now you've got to go and find the materials yourself, and you're still, stuck with your quota. So, it's getting worse for the Israelites initially instead of better. And, even in chapter 5, the Israelites are like, is Moses the right guy for us? So he is facing a lot of challenges, but in each challenge that he faces, he gets some level of confirmation from God that you're going in the right direction, you're going in the right path. And while it may not make sense to you right now, when you look back on it, it will. And when you look back on it entirely, you will know that you had a purpose, you had a calling, and you fulfilled that. And that's where I think we can all relate to Moses. Because if you believe anything about Jeremiah and what Jeremiah says in 29th chapter, I knew you before you were born. And I had a purpose for you. And you're here for a reason. And you're not just a number. So we're all called here for some reason. And I think the pilgrimage of Moses, both in fact and faith, is all of our stories. There is pilgrimage through the desert. There is our pilgrimage in faith. We have our hopes. We have our fears. We have our dreams and our despairs. We have openness and hiddenness. There's glory and there's futility. And it's a totality on the entire spectrum of our experience. And it may be called the struggle of the soul, because our struggle in our whole being is trying to come to the realization of what the Lord's purpose is for us. And that's why I was so moved this week by the story of Moses and what happens in Exodus. And while we're looking back almost 4,000 years ago, it's alive and real today. And I don't know that we're called to be a replacement of Moses, but we certainly have enough information to know who we can be, and in times of trouble, who to turn